What is the real population of London? According to the ONS, there are 8,866,180 people living in London. This makes London the 36th most populous city in the world. That's a lot of resources needed to support those people. Yet every so often there are news stories which suggest the real population is much larger. Water companies often come in for a lot of criticism, and considering the amount of times they release hundreds of tons of raw untreated sewage into rivers, it's not surprising. It's a disgrace. I won't argue with that, but one argument occasionally put forward is that they're dealing with more people than the official figures. Thames Water estimates there are 500,000 illegal immigrants living on the black economy in London alone. There's an estimate that 1 in 12 people in London are illegals. Now, in the 1980s, the population was about 7 million, so it's broadly agreed that London has grown by 40% to 9 million. If you add the 500,000, who are nearly 10 million people living in London. When I moved to London, it was large, though there was little public debate on the growth and the impact on resources. I discussed NHS waiting lists with a friend and said, well, the population's increased substantially, but the number of hospital beds hasn't kept pace. He looked completely bemused and said to me, London hasn't really grown. There isn't really much population growth in the UK. Well, he stopped me in my tracks. He's lived in London for 35 years, during which the population has increased by 40%, but doesn't believe the population's grown much. He's rather wealthy, and part of that Islington elite who can't see London's changing much. I live in the suburbs, and I can see how many small houses have been knocked down and replaced with tower blocks. I see how many shops have had a third floor added on top. I went to Uxbridge the other week, and the old shopping centre seems to be breaking even using the tower blocks built on top of it. I went to RAF Hendon, and there are at least 50 tower blocks of 12 floors or more that used to just be 3 floors a few years ago. I went to an old paint factory covered in apartment blocks. I went to a church I used to attend. My detached house opposite is now a multi-storey block of flats. The factory behind it is now covered in, you guessed it, apartment blocks. To get there, I went past a series of buildings that had been demolished and rebuilt. A pub that was now a block of flats with about 60 flats. Within 10 minutes' drive of where I live, there are at least 2,500 homes added in the last decade, and probably well over 3,000. But then there are the undeclared population. I have friends in hospitals, and they admit that many attendees at A&E are not seriously ill, but simply can't register with a GP because they're not legal. This is because 500,000 illegal immigrants live in London. Yes, an estimated figure, but it's a figure they're avoiding calculating. This is not new. When the EU expanded, the Germans restricted migration for several years from the Eastern European countries. But the UK said, no, we don't need limits. Blair said, well, there'll only be 11,000 from Poland, probably 20,000 all in. But Polish is now the second most spoken language in the UK. I knew several Poles when the EU expanded, and 2 of them were not in the UK legally. They had jobs, they had a dentist, they rented flats, but they had no legal right to be here, and everything was in the black economy. They just overstayed and never been in contact with customs. No one had chased them, no one had tried to remove them, no one had reached out to them. They went to pubs, they dated, they lived cheek by jowl with other Londoners. People on the street probably just thought they were legal like the rest of them on the street. Well, I would suspect that the number living illegally in the UK was the best part of the 11,000 that Tony estimated. Well, what did they do? They took the bus home, flew back as new visitors, and as far as I know, still live in the UK. Now, as I walk around my part of London, I see a lot of evidence that the figures are not real. How many garages and lofts are rented out? How many slough sheds are there? The fact that there's a name for garden structures built as houses but not classed as them has to tell you something. Look out of a window in many London streets and you'll see slough sheds. I reckon there's 2 or 3 in my street. I went to a shop and I had a query. I was asking whether they were selling something, and the guy told me he was sorry, but he wasn't sure. He was very helpful, we got chatting, nice guy, but it didn't take long to realise that he'd arrived as a student a week ago, with a job in the shop waiting for him. He was not going to study, he was going to sit in that corner shop selling envelopes and pens and sticky tape. He came to work in a small shop, not to study. I had a friend who ran a small international food shop. When it closed, I asked him what happened. Well, he told me the other shops don't have to pay living wages as the staff are all illegal. At first I thought he was exaggerating, but I went into those shops and I think there's a fair bit of truth to what he was saying. I had a friend who was illegal for a period, and they paid a signing bonus and a cut of their pay to get their manager to get a job. They worked there for 3 years in that way. There's a canal cutting through West London, and there were always people sleeping rough under there. They flew into Heathrow, lived under bridges, worked, sent money home, and slept by the side of the canal. Now, I don't know if it's still like that, but this has been a problem in London for a very long time. London's always had illegal people living there, but I find it hard to believe that the number living illegally hasn't grown. The media focused on the migrants on lorries coming through Dover, but when the government cracked down, it moved to the boats, and the media concentrated on that. But more than 95% of migrants don't come into the UK that way, and governments have chosen to admit larger and larger numbers, both legally and illegally. Now, you could say they've not allowed the illegals, but when they choose not to measure the number of people overstaying, they are making a choice. Well, I understand why they come. Why did I move to London? For opportunity. Why did I stay in London? Opportunity, roots, community, and yes, a cosmopolitan city. So I understand why immigrants gravitate to London. I saw a GB News programme talking to people in Great Yarmouth, and people said they came there for opportunity. Well, not an insult to Great Yarmouth, but if you wanted job opportunities, you probably went to the wrong place when you arrived in the UK. The government will tell you that less than 85,000 illegal immigrants came to the UK last year, but there's 2 key issues. Firstly, last year they issued higher figures and then said it was a fall. How does that work? They recalculated last year's figures up. This suggests that the figures are, by their own admission, deflated. And secondly, how many students are only checking in to meet the requirements for their visa? And Once they have that visa and are here for a while, simply stop studying, drop out, and stay in the UK and are still here a decade later. There was a very brutal crime recently where everyone involved seemed to have done that. And they'd all been there more than 10 years. When there are demographic changes in Northern Ireland, the media has no issue with discussing these, and they have real implications. But when the size of London grows and 1 in 12 people in London are thought to be illegal, why do so few media want to discuss it? The size of London matters. More people equals more refuse, more grey water, more food stores, more car parking spaces, more buildings, more hospitals, more dentists, more GPs, more primary schools, more secondary schools, more of everything. The whole point of the census is that you collect real data, and from that real data you can plan public resources. Well, I travelled past an old factory recently with 2,000 new homes being built there, and it was huge. The tower blocks go off into the distance. There was this huge structure next to it. I thought, I bet that's going to be a high school. 2,000 homes means in 5 to 10 years, half of those families will have kids that need a school. So they'll need a free-form school to cover these. Well, no, it's self-storage. So I looked up, is there a new school being built? No, they'll ram those into the local schools. And each school's catchment area will shrink and parents will have to put up with it. But it matters how many people live in London, because every single resource and service needs to be increased. So Thames Water have looked at the data they have to hand, and for the second time in a few years, they suggest that the population of London is considerably larger than the official figures. Well, what do the government say? Well, it's old data. So how has that data changed? Who knows? We won't be told. What are the real figures? We don't know, we won't know. For at least the decade, the government has had a solution of answering questions on population by making sure they don't have the data. So how many people leave the country? We don't know. Well, that makes sure we can't answer how many people leave. When I take a flight, I scan my passport at check-in, and I get a boarding card. I then scan my boarding card to reach customs. I may not be stopped and chatted to, but there is a record of me checking in, a record that links to that of me going to customs, and a record of me boarding the plane. And as they do a head count of the plane, a record of me being on the flight. So how do we not know how many people leave the UK? These records are tied to a passport ID, which is tied to a real person, so we know how many people come in and out and who they are. This must deal with 95%. Go to a port and again we check in with passports. It might not be 100% accurate, but there's a simple query on that data to get a record of who left and didn't return. If we don't have an 80% accurate count, it's because we've deliberately chosen not to know. Plausible deniability. The government collects a census every 10 years, and there are news articles on the nationalities. This causes questions or headlines, so we're dropping this from the census going forward, and then ONS won't be able to tell us. Problem solved, explanation, something along the lines of, there are more accurate ways of measuring this. We have asylum seekers going home on holiday several times a year to the country they're supposed to be persecuted in. If we analyse the data, we'd have to deny them asylum. This would be inconvenient, so we don't collect it or obscure it. Do I think Thames Water's figure is 100% right? No, absolutely not. It's bound to have a margin of error. But when the government deliberately doesn't collect data or won't share it with people, it raises questions. You have to find the data somewhere to make decisions. London's population is almost certainly higher than the official figure. This of itself is scandalous. There'll always be errors, but when we choose not to collect and share accurate data, it's worrying. I remember China reissuing their legacy foreign investment figures a few years ago, when it was pointed out that the percentage growth rate didn't add up. You have 100 units, you get 110 units, it's a 10% increase. But when you say it's a 10% increase and the figure's not 10% bigger, it's a little difficult. So they just changed the old data. Well, data always gets rerun. The media tutted, but when the population of a city the size of London is alleged to be wrong by 500,000 people, why do the BBC, Channel 4, Sky News and most newspapers not seem to be particularly interested in this error? Surely they should be revelling in the uncovering of a Tory deceit, because it would have been a Conservative government which masked or allowed this figure to be masked. There's an opportunity for Labour to fix this corrupt incompetence as they're so keen to do. Will they? Or will they just continue to pretend it's 500,000 people smaller? Sadly, I think they're both two stripes of the same, and they won't change it. So we'll continue to have too few hospital beds, too few refuse bins, too few GPs and dentists, too little water pipes, and too many sewage leaks. But don't worry, it's Thames Water's fault. Well, here's an alternative perspective. It's Thames Water's fault for failing to deal with the amount of sewage, and the government's fault for misleading us about the volume of sewage.